Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, mysterious voice. And welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I have found in my travels. Today I want to talk about a short story that I read because it is Short Story Tuesday. I am going to be referring to a short story about comedy and Cuban exiles. I am referring to In Cuba, I Was a German Shepherd by Ana Menéndez from her short story collection In Cuba, I Was a German Shepherd, which is a bunch of stories about Cuba. For those who don't know, Ana Menéndez is an author who was born to Cuban exile parents, so she's writing probably what she knows best. It's interesting because she was born to the Cuban exile parents, and much like some of the characters that she writes about in her stories, like they believed that they would return to Cuba at any time once the situation there returned to normal. And so as a result, she didn't know English until kindergarten because, why teach your daughter English if you're going to return back to a Spanish-speaking country at any moment? And so that pretty much informed her childhood, and it's something that obviously stuck with her because it appears in many of her stories, especially in this collection today. She's written a couple books, which I have not read, but I would be interested in checking out. She's only published 3 stories so far, I believe. She might have published more, but I couldn't find any further information about this. The short story collection that I'm talking about today comes from 2001, so this is about 20 years old at this point, maybe even a bit longer if she hadn't been able to get this published at that time yet. So without further ado, let's talk about In Cuba, I Was a German Shepherd. I will do a brief summary, a little bit of analysis, and we will move on from there. So In Cuba, I Was a German Shepherd focuses on the character of Maximo. He is a Cuban exile living in Miami at a very old age. The story is sort of him reflecting back on his life while dealing with whatever's going on in the present. In Cuba, he was a university sort of teacher, I think. And in 1961, he began to see that things were changing for the worst, as he would believe. And so before Batista was fully deposed, he moved with his family, his wife and 2 daughters, to Miami. And at first he became a taxi driver. He couldn't really work at any university there because his credentials only applied to Cuba. They didn't apply to America. So he worked mainly as a taxi driver until things began to be a little unsafe for him, going through sketchy neighborhoods or something like that. He then convinced his wife to start cooking food for Cuban immigrant laborers, and they made a fair deal of money off that before they opened up their own restaurant, and eventually Maximo would hire his friend Raul, who he knew from Cuba, as a waiter. And this was a somewhat successful restaurant. However, at this point in the story, he is retired. He has sold the restaurant, and his wife is, I believe, is dead at this point. And unfortunately, his children are grown up. One of them is a lawyer. The other one, I don't remember what she is. He doesn't really see his children too often. That might just be because they're busy with their careers, but it could also be because maybe he wasn't a very good parent. The story isn't 100% clear on what the answer is there. Now that Maximo is retired, he spends his day hanging with his friends playing dominoes in Little Havana, with Raul and a few Antonio, I think Carlos, people who are either Cuban or Dominican or some other ethnicity, but they're all playing dominoes for most of the day. They're all slightly annoyed by the fact that sometimes a tourist bus shows up in Little Havana, and all the other sort of dominoes players begin kind of overacting, like hyping up the fact that they're Cuban and being very lively, even though that's not how they're acting during the other times of the day when the tourists don't show up. And it really seems like, to Maximo at least, he's a little frustrated because it seems like the tourists view him as a sort of tourist attraction, a sort of zoo animal, because they just take pictures of him and view him as a sort of oddity, despite the fact that they're the ones who are in Little Havana. Also at this time, Maximo, like throughout the story, he tells a bunch of jokes, and it's clear that the jokes are, like, they're all about Cuba, and they're all like making fun of Fidel or something like that. And it's clear that Maximo hasn't completely gotten over having to leave Cuba all these years, and he's just he uses these jokes as a means of, as I'll talk about later, as a means of coping with this fact that his life was greatly changed after having to leave and go to America. As the story ends, he tells one final joke about a dog that comes to America and tries to flirt with somebody, but it ultimately gets rejected. And the punchline to the joke that that Maximo says is that, in Cuba, I was a German Shepherd, essentially saying I was a much bigger deal in Cuba. And the story kind of ends on a sort of sad note as the other men begin to really fully understand what these jokes mean for Maximo, and the sadness that he's dealing with because he doesn't want to deal with the tourist, and his family isn't really there for him anymore. So yeah, it kind of ends on a downer note there. In terms of analysis, one thing that I think it's pretty easy to see what Ana Menéndez is getting at is she touches a lot on yearning for Cuba, really missing Cuba, what it represented for you, and knowing that you can't really go back to it because it's no longer the Cuba that you remember. That's pretty much what this entire collection is about. It's about Cuba in some way, memories of Cuba, and seeing how it's changed, or trying to get out of Cuba, or something like that. I would say that Ana Menéndez doesn't really like Castro or Castro's Cuba. It feels sort of like American propaganda in that way. But it's not too bad. She doesn't go out of her way to say that Castro is bad and socialism is bad or whatever. But in the story, it's clear that Maximo desires his former life. He was an elite in Cuba. He had a pretty solid family, and things were going pretty well for him, at least by what's indicated in the story. We don't hear too much about his life in Cuba beyond these small details, but if this is what's going on for Maximo, it can't be that bad. But once he has to leave because of this political upheaval that's going on, he finds, sadness in America, and lower status as well, because he goes from being a university professor to being a taxi driver initially, and then moving on to feed Cuban laborers in America. And it's clear that that's not what he wants to do, and he has to convince his wife to open up a restaurant and do this kind of work, which he might very well look down upon. The other kind of sadness that's in America is that he eventually loses his wife Rosa, and his children don't visit him as often anymore. And then once he's retired, he's sort of viewed as an oddity or a zoo animal by the tourists who come through Little Havana. So he no longer has that high status that he once had, and he really does miss Cuba, and it's especially evident because he plays dominoes all day, and he wants this Cuba that no longer exists. But by staying in Little Havana this whole time, it's clear he can't give that up, because maybe if he does, it's going to sink him further in depression or something like that. It's an obsession that you can't have. You can't return back to a place that is completely unrecognizable. Like, he lived in Cuba during the Batista days, and now it's well into the Fidel Castro days, and those are two different Cubas right there. So imagine yearning for a place that no longer exists. Another thing that I think Ana Menéndez does really well in this story is using comedy. Like, she has Maximo tell a lot of jokes, but it's clear that these jokes are a way for Maximo to cope with this intense sadness that he's feeling throughout the story. Because all of his jokes have a common thread to them. Allow me to read you a quote and see if you can see what all these jokes are about. So Bill Clinton dies in office and they freeze his body. Antonio leaned back in his chair and let out a sigh. Here we go. Maximo caught a roll of the eyes and almost grew annoyed, but he smiled. It gets better. He scraped the dominoes in 2 wide circles across the table, then continued. Okay, so they freeze the body, and when we get the technology to unfreeze him, he wakes up in the year 2105. 2105, eh? Very good, Maximo said. Anyway, he's curious about what happened to the world all this time, so he goes up to a Jewish fellow, and he says, so how are things in the Middle East? The guy replies, oh, wonderful, wonderful. Everything is like heaven. Everybody gets along now. This makes Clinton smile, right? The men stop shuffling and drag their pieces across the table, waiting for Maximo to finish. Next, he goes up to an Irishman and he says, so how are things over there in Northern Ireland now? The guy says, Northern? It's one Ireland now, and we all live in peace. Clinton is extremely pleased at this point, right? So he does the biting thing with his lip. Maximo stopped to demonstrate, and Raul and Carlos slapped their hands on the domino table and laughed. Maximo paused. Even Antonio had to smile. Maximo loved this moment, when the men were warming to the joke and he still kept the punchline close to himself, like a secret. So, okay, Maximo continued, Clinton goes up to a Cuban fellow and says, compadre, how are things in Cuba these days? The guy looks at Clinton and he says to the president, let me tell you, my friend, I can feel it in my bones. Any day now, Castro's gonna fall, which is a pretty funny joke. But every single joke is similar to that, and it mentions Cuba and Castro, and it paints Castro in a very negative light. So it's really obvious that through these jokes, Maximo is highlighting his frustrations with the Castro regime and having to leave Cuba in order to maybe survive, and otherwise he would lose his social status or be imprisoned or something like that. But the ending of the story, where he tells the joke about the dog who claims that in Cuba he was a German Shepherd, really highlights his frustrations, as well as the fact that he's telling these jokes to disguise his sadness, because in Cuba he had everything that he could want, but in America he has nothing. He only has these jokes that he can tell, but that's not enough, because he still, at the end of the day, he still has nothing. And I really like how Ana Menéndez uses comedy to express that fact for Maximo. Overall, I would say I really enjoyed this story, but one problem with it is it does feel a little incomplete. I feel like Ana Menéndez has a good outline for a story here, but I feel it's maybe a bit rushed, and there isn't enough about Maximo's past, or even enough about why his children don't talk to him anymore for this story. I feel like Menéndez could have done a little bit more to make this story feel a bit more complete. And not having enough about the past, it's not really a problem, but it does sort of make this whole story just feel like an outline, which is often sometimes what short stories are. So I can't really complain about it. Anyway, those are my thoughts on In Cuba, I Was a German Shepherd by Ana Menéndez, a pretty wonderful short story from a pretty interesting collection. I would say I recommend this collection as well as this short story in particular, as they present a lot of sort of an interesting perspective on Cuba, as well as a sadness with wanting to leave Cuba, but also wanting to return. And as it even says in the back, like we can't really outrun our origins, because we eventually want to return home or something like that, but perhaps we can't, because as some people say, you can't go home or whatever, or you can go home or something like that. But for people in Cuba, the Cuba that exists now is not like the Cuba that existed before 1960. So you can't really return to a place that probably doesn't even want you, or looks nowhere near what you remember from growing up. So a lot of sadness, a lot of frustration with this story. If you read the story before, or you simply want to comment on something that I said, feel free to do so below. Let's have a discussion about In Cuba, I Was a German Shepherd. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about Ana Menéndez. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and Cuba-ish travels. Farewell.